Hello everyone! In Genshin's final patch in Notlan, Ineffa will be releasing as the first character from nod-krai, the next major region of the game. While her abilities themselves are quite simple, she introduces a completely new reaction into the game which may be indicative of the upcoming core mechanic for the new nod-krai characters. On top of that, she's looking like a pretty solid character already and will likely get even better once nod-krai releases. To understand how good Ineffa is currently and potentially in the future, in this comprehensive guide I will be explaining how Ineffa works, the best ways to build her potential best teams, and analyzing her place in the meta in terms of overall strength and pull value. Pretty much everything you need to know with simple and practical explanations while also giving more detailed analysis that is backed by TC, including plenty of pre-release calcs on Ineffa. Ineffa is a 5-star Electro polearm off-field sub-DPS who ascends with crit rate. Her primary mechanic lies in her special passive. When Ineffa is on a team, any Electro-Charged reactions are turned into a new reaction called Lunar-Charged. In addition, Ineffa directly buffs the damage of Lunar-Charged by a max of 14% as long as she has at least 2000 attack. This passive will also get further blessings following the new moon's rise, something that we will only understand once nod-krai releases. But the big question to answer is, how does Lunar-Charged work? While the livestream has described how Lunar-Charged works, there has been pre-release footage of it, and there is a damage formula from beta, there are still some details about the new reactions mechanics that are still a little unclear and will need confirmation with testing. I will describe the current understanding of Lunar-Charged that most TCers are going with, which I think makes the most sense. To properly understand Lunar-Charged, we should first remind ourselves what regular Electro-Charged does. Electro-Charged is triggered when you apply Hydro and Electro on an enemy. When this happens, the enemy will have an Electro-Charged aura where they are affected by Hydro and Electro simultaneously. The Electro-Charged target will take Electro damage every second alongside any nearby enemies that are affected by Hydro. Each tick of damage consumes both the Hydro and Electro auras, and the damage will stop when one of the auras is depleted. Since Electro-Charged is a transformative reaction, it ignores defense, can't crit, isn't buffed by damage percent, and mainly scales with character level and elemental mastery. The character who applies Hydro or Electro last will take ownership of the reaction, and thus the game will use their stats to calculate the damage of the reaction. So if you apply Hydro then Electro, only the Electro character's level and elemental mastery will determine the damage. But if the opposite happens, then the Hydro character will take ownership of the reaction, leading to inconsistent reaction ownership. This is one of the main reasons why Electro-Charged teams don't have their Hydro or Electro units built full EM to maximize the reaction damage. Since either the Hydro or Electro character can trigger the reaction, technically both need to be built full EM to ensure the Electro-Charged reaction is buffed by any EM build. But if you build both units full EM, you lose a lot of damage from their talents because you aren't building as much crit and attack. An on-field Animo driver can circumvent this problem, however, because when they trigger Swirl, they can be the one to trigger most of the Electro-Charged reactions, and this is why Taser teams with Animo drivers are the only ones who build full EM on the team. Lunar-Charged, however, works differently. It is still triggered when applying Hydro and Electro onto an enemy, but when this happens, a Thundercloud will spawn which will deal Electro damage to enemies affected by both Hydro and Electro every 2 seconds. If there are no enemies affected by both Hydro and Electro, the cloud won't deal damage and will disappear after about 5 seconds. Unlike Electro-Charged, which can deal AoE damage with each damage tick, each Lunar-Charged reaction hits a single enemy. Lunar-Charged acts like a transformative reaction where it ignores defense, isn't buffed by damage percent, and scales with character level and elemental mastery. However, the damage of the Lunar-Charged reaction also scales with the character's crit stats. But unlike other reactions which calculate the damage using the stats of the character who triggers the reaction, Lunar-Charged counts every character that participates. Lunar-Charged deals damage every 2 seconds. Within each 2-second time frame, the game allows any character who applies Hydro or Electro onto an enemy to take part in the reaction. Swirls are of course included. So for example, if you have 2 Electro units and 2 Hydro units applying their elements in this time frame, all of them will share reaction ownership. Once the game sees which characters are taking part in the reaction, it will calculate the individual Lunar-Charged damage for each character using their stats with the damage formula. The first value is the level multiplier, so at level 90 the final value is 2604. Then it's multiplied by buffs like Ineffa's special passive, which directly buffs the damage of Lunar-Charged by a max of 14%, the EM buff which increases with more elemental mastery, and other reaction buffs like 4-piece Thundering Fury or Ineffa C1. And lastly, the damage number takes into account whether it crits or not using the character's crit stats as well as the enemy res. So for every character that applies Hydro or Electro within 2 seconds, a damage number for the reaction will be calculated for each one of them. Then to get the final damage of the reaction, the game adds up all the individual numbers. However, only the highest damage number gets full value. The second highest number gets halved, and the third and fourth highest damage numbers, if there are 3 or 4 total characters that contributed to the reaction, gets multiplied by 1/12 before getting summed up. So most of the damage comes from the top 2 contributors, which which will generally be the characters with the most crit and EM. Do keep in mind that because of crit variance, the ranking of the contributors toward the Lunar-Charged reaction can change depending on whether or not an individual character crits or not, resulting in some variability in the reaction damage. So while normal Electro-Charged is a transformative reaction that can deal AoE damage every second and calcs the damage from the one character triggering the reaction, Lunar-Charged is a transformative reaction that deals single target damage every 2 seconds, takes into account a character's crit stats, and allows all characters that apply Hydro or Electro within each 2-second time frame to take part in the reaction, meaning that its damage isn't calced from the stats of just one character. In regards to how good Lunar-Charged is compared to Electro-Charged damage-wise, the Lunar-Charged reaction isn't really a massive upgrade over the Electro-Charged reaction. The damage of both is relatively similar, and in some scenarios, Lunar-Charged is worse. For instance, in Taser teams with an anima driver that builds them full EM to maximize Electro-Charged damage, they would rather have Electro-Charged, which scales better with EM, rather than Lunar-Charged, which has crit scaling, which full EM anima drivers don't build. But applying elements to trigger a Lunar-Charged reaction isn't the only way to deal Lunar-Charged damage. Some characters' abilities can directly deal Lunar-Charged damage itself. In patch 5.8, Ineffa's A1 passive and some of her Constellations are the only examples of this, but it is likely that a future character will also have the same feature. Like other damaging abilities, this will scale off attack and its multiplier, but because it is considered Lunar-Charged damage, it also calculates the damage similarly to a Lunar-Charged reaction. Notably, the damage will ignore defense, scales with EM, and isn't buffed by damage percent. In addition, the final damage is also multiplied by 3. Thus, direct Lunar-Charge is very important for a character's damage. That's everything we currently know about the new reaction, Lunar-Charged. In comparison to the reaction's detailed mechanical complexity, Ineffa's actual abilities are very simple and have the same function as other existing off-field characters like Fischl and Emily. Ineffa's skill does initial damage on cast, creates an electro shield scaling off her attack, and summons a robot for 20 seconds that will target an enemy and deal AoE damage every 2 seconds. This is Ineffa's off-field turret, and it has a 2/3 chance of generating a particle every time it attacks and hits an enemy. The damage coming from the skill itself isn't very impressive. Most of Ineffa's damage actually comes from her A1 passive. Whenever her robot attacks but there are thunderclouds nearby, meaning you have triggered Lunar-Charged, the robot will initiate an additional attack. This attack is considered Lunar-Charged damage, meaning that it acts similarly to the Lunar-Charged reaction damage where it ignores defense and is buffed by things like EM, but it also accounts for the attack multiplier and does triple the original damage. So most of Ineffa's personal damage comes from these A1 procs, meaning that her teams will want to periodically trigger Lunar-Charged. Ineffa's elemental burst also acts similarly to Fischl's and Emily's burst. It simply does damage and spawns her robot if it isn't active, or respawns it if it is active and resets its duration. With her A4 passive, using the burst also allows Ineffa to buff her and the active character's elemental mastery for 20 seconds based on her attack. So talent priority wise, level skill, then her burst. Lastly, Ineffa has another special passive that gives additional ingredients when using food and allows you to customize Ineffa's appearance when in nod-krai. That's all the details about Ineffa's base kit. Now let's go over her Constellations. C1 gives an additional buff to Lunar-Charged damage after she uses her skill, giving the max buff of 50% at 2000 attack. C2 adds an additional damage instance after enemies are hit with her burst, and this damage is considered Lunar-Charged damage. In addition, C2 allows Ineffa's burst to generate her shield for all party members, which allows co-op shielding and makes using Ineffa's skill optional. C3 increases her skill talent level by 3, C4 gives Ineffa energy whenever the Lunar-Charged reaction is triggered, C5 increases her burst talent level by 3, and lastly, while the C1 buff is active, C6 enables extra AoE damage instances after Lunar-Charged procs every 3.5 seconds, and this damage is considered Lunar-Charged damage. Based on calcs done by theory crafter hyperwebster, Ineffa's Constellations are overall good. Her talent level increasing cons don't do much, but her early Constellations like her C2 is a good personal damage increase, though main DPS damage increasing cons are generally better value, and her C1 is promising because it buffs Lunar-Charged damage. The only really relevant thing this buffs currently is Ineffa's A1, but when a future main DPS releases in nod-krai who also deals Lunar-Charged damage in their kit, Ineffa's C1 will gain a lot more value to buff their damage. Now let's go over Ineffa's current best weapon options. Her signature Fractured Halo is her best in slot, gives a lot of damage stats for her, and buffs Lunar-Charged damage whenever the wielder creates a shield. While this buff isn't that impactful now, it will gain a lot more value when future Lunar-Charged DPSs are released. Other 5-star stat sticks that are also good to use for damage include Calamity Queller, Staff of Scarlet Sands, Escoffier's signature, Emily's signature, and Staff of Homa. For 4-star weapons, both Battle Pass polearms are great options for Ineffa's personal damage. For a more supportive weapon, Favonius Lance is always a useful option for the ER. For the best free-to-play polearms, you can use Missive Wind Spear or the Inazuma Incredible Katane Cross Spear. Here is a more detailed weapon comparison made by hyperwebster. Feel free to pause and take a look for more specifics. Next, for artifact sets, Ineffa doesn't currently have a dedicated set. Her two best current sets in 5.8 are Gilded Dreams for damage and Tenacity of the Millilith for its attack buff, and 2-piece of EM and attack are closely behind. However, it is very likely that in 6.0 there will be a new artifact set releasing that synergizes well with Ineffa, so I highly recommend waiting to farm a specific set for Ineffa and just use whatever good pieces you have currently. For artifact stats, Attack Hourglass, Attack Goblet, and Crit Circlet is the overall best option. It maximizes her Lunar-Charged damage buff, shield strength, and her EM buff after using burst, which will be more valuable for a future Lunar-Charged based DPS. For substats, you want crit, attack, EM, and energy recharge if applicable. Ineffa's energy requirements heavily depends on the team she's playing in. If she's solo Electro, you're generally better off ignoring ER and just bursting every other rotation. For double Electro, in some teams, Ineffa needs about 130 ER to burst every rotation, while in other teams, she might need up to 160 ER. Finally, let's go over Ineffa's best team comps. Before we dive in, I want to first mention that I will be showing team DPS calcs done by hyperwebster. Here are some notes and the assumptions used in his calculations. And as always, other TCers may have different numbers and results because they use different assumptions. So don't take results out of context and directly compare calcs between different TCers. Consume TC responsibly. Ineffa can technically be used as the generic off-field Electro unit in any team instead of Fischl or Yai, even without Hydro. For instance, in Chevre's Overload teams and Spread or Aggravate teams, Ineffa's AoE off-field electro damage works fine alongside bringing a shield and a small EM buff with burst. However, Ineffa loses a lot of personal damage because without thunderclouds from triggering Lunar-Charged, her A1 passive isn't active. So while Ineffa can still technically work in these teams, she prefers to be in teams that trigger Lunar-Charged, aka Electro-Charged. Ineffa can be played as the main on-fielder in a Lunar-Charged team, getting all the buffs for her personal damage, and it's surprisingly not bad. However, in most cases, she'll be played as an off-field Electro sub-DPS, typically taking over the slot that Auroron or Fischl takes in Electro-Charged teams for an overall team DPS upgrade. For instance, Taser teams with Animo drivers like Aoife, Mizuki, and Sucrose can benefit from Ineffa, mainly due to her relatively high personal damage as a sub-DPS. Electro main DPSs like Cloran, Raiden, and Varessa can also benefit from Ineffa. While their Chevre's Overload teams will generally be the better team archetype in terms of damage, Ineffa does buff their previously Electro-Charged teams with her presence. In a similar way, Hydro on-fielders and Taser teams will get buffed with Ineffa. The main Hydro main DPS, of course, is Neuvillette. Similar to Neuvillette's Freeze team with Escoffier, Neuvillette with Ineffa is one of his highest sheet DPS teams, but using Ineffa means you trade Neuvillette's damage for Ineffa's sub-DPS damage, which doesn't scale as well with more vertical investment compared to the standard Kazuha Shilonen team. However, unlike the Escoffier team, which I was against calling a strict upgrade, the Ineffa team is better because her off-field damage is AoE, and you don't lose an A1 stack on Neuvillette when using Ineffa. So this Neuvillette team will definitely be very strong, especially against favorable content matchups. For the teams I've highlighted, their main and only reaction is Lunar-Charged, aka Electro-Charged. However, Ineffa doesn't necessarily need constant Lunar-Charge procs. Remember that the damage of the reaction itself is similar to normal Electro-Charge, so it isn't that impressive. The main reason you want to trigger Lunar-Charge is to activate Ineffa's A1 passive, which is the main source of her off-field damage. But it only requires thunderclouds to be present, and the thundercloud lingers for about 5 seconds after there isn't any enemy with both a Hydro and Electro aura. So you technically only need to trigger Lunar-Charged about every 5 seconds and can thus incorporate other elements into the team, as long as you can periodically trigger Lunar-Charged. One example includes Overvape teams. These teams do function in regards to performance for Arlecchino specifically, though her best melt team with Sitlali does do more damage in the best scenarios. The Ineffa Overvape team isn't too far behind while being easier to play, as you don't have to worry about melt timings. This is assuming Ineffa's damage doesn't snapshot. If it does, the Overvape teams do improve in damage, but whether or not Ineffa's damage snapshots is unclear and will need to be confirmed on release. Another example is Hyperbloom oriented teams such as with Alhaitham. Double Dendro with Nahida is likely not possible because there would be too much Dendro for Lunar-Charge uptime, but double Hydro or double Electro should still work, allowing Ineffa to act as a solid Kuki alternative for the team. To conclude this Ineffa guide, I wanted to share my analysis on her place in the meta in terms of overall strength and pull value. Ineffa is impossible to properly evaluate currently because a lot of her potential will likely unlock when nod-krai is out. On her release in patch 5.8, Ineffa will still be a solid off-field Electro character for primarily Taser teams, while still being usable as a more general sub-DPS in teams like Overvape and Hyperplume. By enabling Lunar-Charge to activate her A1 passive, Ineffa does a lot of personal damage, resulting in an overall buff for the current existing Electro-Charge oriented support-oriented teams. These teams are not the strongest teams in the current meta, but buffing them is nice and they will be strong to use on the patch, as the endgame content in 5.8 will favor these team archetypes. Ineffa is in a very similar situation as Emily was in patch 4.8. Emily was released as a burning-oriented sub-DPS who only had her potential unlocked when Kaniche released in patch 5.0 as a burning main DPS, but compared to Emily, who only provides her personal damage to a Kaniche team, Ineffa works in more teams as a generic sub-DPS, does more damage, provides a shield, has an EM buff on her burst, and provides a buff to Lunar-Charged damage with her passive, as well as her C1 and signature weapon if you have it. And this is the main reason Ineffa's strength and value as a character depends on what comes out in nod-krai. On her release, Ineffa's buffs really only benefit herself. Other DPSs don't really take full advantage of her EM or Lunar-Charged buff, so she doesn't really have any amazing synergies. But in 6.0, there will very likely be a Lunar-Charged oriented main DPS who can take advantage of Ineffa's buffs to significantly increase their damage, making Ineffa much more valuable as a character. On top of that, there can be future nod-krai supports that synergize better with Ineffa, new artifact sets, and we'll finally know about this extra blessing granted in Ineffa's special passive. Ultimately, Ineffa will be a good unit on release as she does buff current Electro-Charged teams, but her true strength, pull value, and place in the meta will only really be known once we get our first info about nod-krai. So if you're a person who's fine with following pre-release info, you should probably wait for the 6.0 beta to start, which will reveal what's actually coming out in nod-krai and how much better Ineffa will get. And that's everything that I wanted to cover about Ineffa. Big thanks to hyperwebster for allowing me to showcase his calcs in this video and helping me with my personal understanding on Lunar-Charged and Ineffa. He is always solid in his TC work. I hope this guide and analysis was helpful to you all in giving you a better understanding of everything related to Ineffa. Just clicking and watching the video helps the channel out immensely, and if you want to show even more support, consider liking or sharing the video, or click the subscribe button for more Genshin guide and analysis videos in the future. Leave any questions in the comments, and for all of you planning on wishing, I wish you all the best of luck on your Ineffa pools.